Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt.
Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 3. Turning Tables. Telly thought she'd been prepared for anything after she dropped the bombshell about Shane Creighton murdering his wife. Part of her had expected Alder to just stare at her in disbelief, laugh at her even, or maybe even turn around and leave her alone in the kitchen, not even bothering to listen to her. Another, definitely way smaller part, had waited for her eyes to light up, to put a hand on Telly's shoulder and congratulate her on the brilliant detective work she had just shown. What she had not expected had been Alder's emotionless expression and a simple shrug of her shoulders. Her reply had only consisted of 2 single words. I know. Telly had blinked at her in confusion. For a second she had believed that Alder would simply leave it at that. But to her surprise, she had then actually been generous enough to share some more information with Telly. I knew something was up with him the second I saw him standing in the hallway, being more concerned with telling the officer the brand and pricing of his suit than with the fact that his dead wife was lying in the next room. It took 2 minutes of awful small talk until his statement became somewhat contradictory. She had looked at Telly again, this time with something almost close to a genuine interest in her eyes. What I'm not quite getting behind, though, is how you want to prove any of this, considering you haven't even talked to Creighton yet. Telly hadn't wasted much time after that remark and had quickly shared her observations in the living room. The chaos, which had just been a bit too organized, the position of the body, and the valuable items the burglar just didn't seem to care about. Alder had followed her words attentively, and it had been fairly obvious that she had been far from convinced. However, Telly had another ace up her sleeve. I know all of this is circumstantial at best, but everything clicked when I saw the 2 cars in the driveway. This time, Alder was blinking at Telly in confusion, and Telly had to hold back a laugh. It had been nice seeing Alder completely clueless for once. The cars? Yes. Creighton said his wife had left the party early, while he stayed almost until the morning. Yet, his car is parked in front of his wife's. I highly doubt he'd ever fit into her tiny Mini, and he said earlier that he didn't drink all night and drove home in his car by himself. So unless he started some crazy reparking adventure once he discovered his dead wife, there's no explanation for that, other than that he had in fact arrived before his wife, which makes the whole burglar story absolutely implausible. That is so simple, it might actually work. For a split second, Alder had actually looked impressed, but the moment passed way too quickly, and soon the indifferent facade had been put back in place. She had pressed her lips together firmly and had walked towards the door. When she had already been halfway out of the room, she had turned around to Telly once more, eyebrows raised expectantly, face full of determination. What are you waiting for, Craven? Let's take this bastard on a nice trip to the station. That's how Telly had ended up in a tiny room behind a large one-sided mirror. Apart from her, there were only 2 other detectives in the room. Detective Buttonwood, a young, rather boring-looking man, and another older woman that Telly hadn't seen before. Both were, however, more occupied with the case file in their hands than with anything happening behind the mirror. Telly, on the other hand, observed the scene with great fascination. Detective Alder had been walking across the room for several minutes now, hands folded behind her back. The reserved yet friendly face she had put on while talking to Shane Creighton in his house had been replaced by a stone-cold expression. She looked almost threatening, and Tally was rolling her eyes at the thought, absolutely radiant. Alder's back was turned to Tally when she bowed down slightly and grabbed the table with both hands. It took Tally all of her self-control to not let her eyes wander, and appreciate again just how well Alder fit those jeans. But this was a serious matter. Despite the evidence and the contradictions in Creighton's statement, they still needed a confession to properly charge the man with murder, and even though Alder had been working him for almost an hour now, he had barely spoken a single word since they'd gotten here. As soon as Creighton had realized that he had no longer been the victim, but rather the main suspect in his wife's murder, his whole behavior had changed completely. The cooperative, charismatic, overly conscious politician had been taken over by an impassive shell of a man that didn't seem to care about what was happening around him. Alder had presented him with the evidence against him. He had listened carefully, only losing his poker face for a split second when Alder mentioned the cars in the driveway. Still, he had known better than to try and find some reasonable explanation for it. Instead, he had apparently decided that silence is golden. Tally could see how Alder was getting more and more frustrated. She had snapped at Creighton several times already, tried to threaten him with the lifelong prison sentence that awaited him, and tried to offer him a lighter sentence when he cooperated. She had gotten louder and louder, but Creighton only kept staring straight ahead, lips tightly pressed together, and Tally knew that it was driving Alder nuts. So, after another unsuccessful attempt, she watched Alder take a deep breath and ultimately leave the interrogation room to give herself a tiny break. Only seconds later, she stormed into the room where Tally was waiting. "Can you believe that guy? He knows we have him, but he also knows that we are screwed without his confession. Goddess, I hate it when they act like this." Tally's first instinct was to calm Alder down, knowing fully well that she wouldn't reach anything with Creighton if she was boiling with rage. Calming her down, however, was easier said than done. Even after the short amount of time she had been working with Detective Alder, she knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't the type of woman that liked to be cuddled. Tally wouldn't reach anything with uplifting words or an encouraging smile. The only way this would go anywhere was by telling Alder the truth, which would very likely make her even angrier than she already was. Still, it was not like she had much of a choice, and Alder would get over it eventually. So, Tally just went for it. "The way you talk to him is standard protocol and the normal approach for every interrogation." "I know that." "Then what about it?" I don't think you will get through to him like this. It's not the right way." As expected, Tally's words only seemed to infuriate Alder more. "And what do you and your years and years of experience suggest we do about that?" The mocking tone in her voice was clearly meant to hurt Tally, but by now she was so used to getting underestimated that she didn't care in the slightest. Instead, she could feel a wave of familiar anger starting to burn inside of her, and before she could stop herself, words started to fall out of her mouth. "Can you please, for 1 second, stop treating me like some stupid child and actually listen to what I have to say?" She almost didn't recognize her dangerously low and calm voice. "I know I don't have as much experience as you. I know that you're brilliant at interrogating people, and I know that intimidation and threats usually do the trick for you, but you can't deny that it does not seem to have the slightest effect on that guy." Tally briefly nodded in the direction of Shane Creighton, then continued before Alder had a chance to interrupt her. "I am not doing this to undermine your authority in any way. I'm just here to do my job. And excuse me for saying that. That job is not to please you." Oh, she desperately wanted to please her, impress her even. But there was no way in hell she'd let her know that, and for now, her hard words seemed to do the trick. Alder opened her mouth to shoot back, then, to Tally's surprise, closed it again. The anger and shock on her face, that Tally dared to speak to her like that, was impossible to hide, but there was something else sparkling in her eyes. She almost looked impressed? Still, Alder did her best to mask that feeling and only raised her eyebrows in response. Tally took this as a sign to continue talking. "Men like him always dislike women with power, believe it or not. He's scared of you. Not of the things you're threatening him with, but of you as a person. There's no way he'd ever admit it. He probably can't fully grasp it himself. But he has absolutely no idea how to act around you. That's why he's retreating more and more every time you start another attempt to get him talking. For him, it's all about control. He cannot control you, but he can control his silence. And that's exactly why we need to give him the feeling that he's back in control. Let him believe he's pushing our buttons while we're actually pushing his. And how do you want to do that? By giving him exactly the kind of woman he's used to. Someone who makes it all too easy for him to lower his guard. We give him a woman that knows her place, admires him even. Someone he feels clearly superior to. It's going to make him feel powerful again, like he is in control. And that's when he's going to make his mistake. She could see Alder struggling with herself. The older detective looked like she knew Tally was right, but actually admitting that and giving away some of her own control over the situation seemed to be one of the hardest things for her. Detective Alder, please. It's not like we have much to lose. Let me go in and talk to him. When Alder lowered her shoulders slightly and sighed in resignation, Tally knew she had won. Okay, thank you. Tally nodded gratefully, turned around and walked into the interrogation room. She had expected to be nervous, to maybe recite all the pages on interrogation techniques she had memorized in her head, but when she entered the room, a strange calm washed over her. It was like her whole body knew that this was what she had been destined to do her entire life. Shane Creighton looked up when she entered, and Tally sent a carefully calculated smile in his direction. He didn't seem to recognize her from the crime scene, but Tally hadn't expected anything less. She was usually invisible to men like him, but had learned to use that to her advantage, just as she had guessed. His whole demeanor changed as soon as she sat down opposite him. His body visibly relaxed. He lifted his head and a smug expression appeared on his face. She was young, nice to look at, and inexperienced. Exactly the kind of woman he was used to dealing with. Oh, just you wait, Tally thought, while awkwardly playing with the strand of her hair and letting her gaze wander through the room as if she was kind of overwhelmed with the whole situation. They both stayed silent for a little while, but after Creighton had given her another once-over, he actually began to speak. So, are we starting with the good cop, bad cop shit now, sweetheart? Well, at least you look like you're a lot more fun to deal with than that Alder woman. Tally barely managed to hide the uncomfortable shiver that went through her body when Creighton called her a sweetheart. It only took 2 sentences, and everything inside of her was already longing to punch Creighton's grin right out of his smug face. But she remained calm, and only blinked at him sweetly through her lashes. Yeah, she can be a lot, right? You can be glad you only need to deal with her today. Imagine having to work with her every day. Honestly, they should pay me extra for that. She's always so secretive and controlling, like this whole place belongs to her. But let me tell you something. It doesn't. She winked at the older man, and when she watched him leaning back even further into his chair, slightly chuckling at her words, she knew she had him. She continued to sympathize with him, complain about Detective Alder some more, and then slowly moved on to more sensitive subjects. She asked him about the party last night, about his relationship with his wife and how she was behaving at the party. Tally always made sure to get some small details wrong, gave Creighton the chance to correct her, and let him appear in control of what he was sharing with her. The man grew more and more comfortable around her. Tally kept stroking his ego by mentioning that she could only imagine what a hard-working man Creighton was. She slowly began to center her words more and more around his wife, how she thought his wife should be incredibly grateful for the life he had been offering her, how she hoped she had done everything in her power to make him happy, because Tally herself could only dream of living the life she had lived. This was when he cracked. He snorted at Tally's words, then told her about difficulties in his marriage, and all of a sudden went into a full monologue about how ungrateful she had been and how Tally would surely understand that he simply had no other choice. He realized what he had been saying a second too late, and a victorious grin appeared on Tally's face. Realization hit Creighton, but instead of drawing back again, the man finally seemed to realize that he had lost. He buried his head in his hands and told Tally everything. His wife had left the party earlier last night because she apparently had not been feeling well. But when he had arrived home earlier than planned, he had found his house empty. He had suspected his wife to cheat on him for a while now, and the empty house had been all the proof that he needed. He'd seen red, had, blinded by his own anger, started to destroy each of their photographs in the living room. That had been when his wife had arrived home. He had confronted her right away, had not believed any of her excuses, and when she had finally confessed that she had been seeing another man, he had been so out of it that he had grabbed an old dagger from one of the drawers and had stabbed his wife until she had collapsed on the ground. The chaos he had already created during his outburst had then gotten him the idea to stage the burglary. Shane Creighton almost seemed relieved when he signed his full confession not even 30 minutes later. Detective Alder was already waiting for Tally outside the interrogation room. She had her arms crossed in front of her body and mustered the young detective thoughtfully. That was quite impressive. Tally was surprised by the sincerity in her voice. It was a small compliment, but it flattered her more than she would want to admit. She bit the inside of her cheek to stop herself from grinning like a little girl that had just been given her favorite sweet. "Oh, that was nothing," Tally shrugged it off. "That's not nothing. That's instinct, Craven. It's what you need to be good at this job, and it seems like you have a fair amount of it inside of you. Stuff like this is just easy for me. When I see someone, I usually know what kind of person is standing in front of me, and how I need to act around them, to get along with them, except for... Except for what?" Tally looked down, already regretting that slip of her tongue, and desperately thinking about a way to get out of that situation. But Alder wouldn't let go of it. "Craven, what is it?" This is gonna sound strange and definitely inappropriate. Alder curiously raised an eyebrow. "Say what's on your mind." "Well, except for you. You seem to be one of the few people I just can't figure out. I know you're more than what you let people see, and I want to get behind what this is. You're like a mystery that I desperately want to solve." That had definitely not been what Alder had expected. Tally had caught her off guard, and for a second, she could catch a glimpse of the vulnerable woman hiding behind the stone-cold detective. The smile she sent towards Tally was tired, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Craven, but some mysteries are better left unsolved. They might not always reveal what you are hoping for." With that, she stepped a bit closer, reached out and clumsily petted Tally's shoulder. It was only the briefest of touch, but Tally couldn't help and lean into it. She thought Alder would leave it at that, but then the older woman smiled at her again. "I'm very pleased with your work today. Maybe the captain hasn't been entirely wrong about you." "Thank you," Tally replied, then added quietly, "And I hope you know that I didn't mean any of the stuff I said in there, especially about working with you." Alder only chuckled, but didn't break the contact just yet. "Well, I couldn't blame you if you did." She still looked a bit absent, lost in her own thoughts, but before Tally dared to speak again, the moment was over. Alder loosened her grip on Tally's shoulder and stepped back. "Anyway, we have lots of paperwork to do now, and then I guess I have no other choice but to speak to the press." There it was again, that dark shadow on her face as soon as she was speaking about the press. "I could do it if you want to." But Alder shook her head. "No, that's out of the question. The captain wanted someone with media experience, so that's what we will need to give her. You go back to your desk and start filing. I'm not letting them pick you apart with their questions." Her voice was completely cold again now. Still, Tally couldn't stop a warm feeling from spreading inside of her at the almost protective words in her last sentence. Maybe this partnership wasn't completely doomed after all. She left Alder to quickly grab a cup of coffee from the kitchen. When she entered the bullpen, she was still busy understanding the meaning behind Alder's words. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. That meant there definitely was a mystery to solve. There was more to Alder's past, stuff she didn't know yet, but she was definitely not giving up now. Alder herself was already seated behind her desk, talking to someone on the phone, and Tally was about to head to her own desk when someone was walking up behind her and grabbed her shoulder. Hey, Craven. Tally turned around to find one of the detectives who had been with her in the interrogation room standing in the hallway. Detective Buttonwood, right? Call me Garrett. He smiled at her widely and stepped closer, his hand still not leaving Tally's shoulder. The way you stood up to Alder in there? Damn, that was hot. I was just doing my job. Tally didn't quite know how to respond to that, but Garrett didn't really seem to care. He just went on with praising Tally's actions. I feel like more people here should do that, you know? Alder's being treated here like some sort of saint when all she does is make a grim face and boss everyone around. If you ask me, she's just some sexually frustrated woman that enjoys humiliating other people. Excuse me? I mean, don't get me wrong, she's hot and everything, and she's had her fair share of arrests, but that's not reason to act like a complete bitch around everyone. Tally suddenly felt very protective of Alder. She shrugged Garrett's hand off of her shoulder and snapped at him. And by everyone, you mean you? Because you didn't manage to get into her pants yet? Listen, she's my partner, okay? And despite her flaws, she's a better cop than you will ever be. Hey, no need to get so defensive. It's not like you two are getting along well. Besides, she's definitely not my type. Too old, too moody. Too many brain cells, Tally thought to herself. You, on the other hand. He actually had the audacity to wink at her after that comment. Tally rolled her eyes. Men. Apparently dealing with one testosterone-driven asshole per day wasn't enough. Under different circumstances, she would have considered being mindful of Garrett's feelings. But the way he had just been talking about Alder and his general attitude towards women was truly pissing her off. The feeling's not mutual. She turned around and was about to walk away when she could feel Garrett grabbing her arm once more. You're saying that now, but let me try and convince you over dinner. Tally twisted herself free from his grasp, her blood boiling. She was speaking loud enough that several heads were already turning in her direction. Listen, I am not looking to date anyone, and even if I would, you would be the last. Tally, here you are. Abigail's voice interrupted them and prevented Tally from causing a scene in front of half of the department. Grateful for the rescue, Tally turned to her. Now what was that all about? Abigail asked curiously, eyeing Garrett, who had finally seemed to receive the message and was walking away without looking back. Nothing I couldn't handle, Tally reassured her. But oh my God, you are not going to believe the day I've been having. Tell me everything. Tally realized only now that at her desk, Alder was suddenly very busy going through some files, and was desperately trying not to look in her direction. She began to wonder just how much of that encounter with Garrett the older detective had heard.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.